Mm, This session is being recorded. All right, welcome everyone. We've got a great one for you today. Today's event is on design thinking applied in higher education. Not only will you hear from an expert in design thinking with years of experience working across all industries, including ours, but you'll also hear from two of your peers with real-world examples of applying design thinking in their organizations. Jeff Warren is the president of the Barclay Consulting Group and specializes in design thinking and business relationship management. He is an accomplished practitioner and has led numerous workshops for clients in education, including the State University of New York, otherwise known as SUNY. He is joined today by Steve Ackerson with the University of St. Thomas. And to be clear, this is in Minnesota, not in the Caribbean. So just want you all to know that. Although Steve may be preferred to be in the Caribbean right now, which I would totally, well, not right now because there's a hurricane, but our thoughts and prayers go out with people in that area right now. So, he'll share two case studies of applying design thinking. The first is to tackle the student experience with remote learning during the pandemic, and the second for college selection for undeserved populations. The other panelist is Susan Van Alstyne. Susan is the library director of the Taylor Memorial Library at Centenary University. She will share how she will use design thinking to optimize the student experience in academic libraries. So today's format, we're going to have a presentation that lasts roughly 60 minutes. There will be plenty of time to add your questions in the Q&A window. We'll take them throughout. We'll take them at the end. We're scheduled for 90 minutes, so there's plenty of time to interact with our panelists. Feel free to post your questions throughout. We encourage you to use the chat window to talk to each other. Engage in conversation. No one's going to be offended if you're talking to a colleague. You're here to learn. You're here to network with each other. The webinar is being recorded and will be available on the EDUCAUSE ITSM website within 5 business days. All right, without further ado, I will turn it over to Jeff.
Well, thanks, Mitch, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Interesting topic, design thinking. I want you to think today more about being taken on a journey. Design thinking is something that addresses the creative side in all of us. And what's interesting is we're all born creative. I don't know how many of you have seen a child that picks up an iPhone or an Android or whatever your device du jour is, and they start using it, and they use it in a way that everybody looks at them and marvels at how smart they are because they're picking up these things so quickly. And they do it because they were born to be creative, so are we, and they haven't been told yet not to do certain things or assume this is the way certain things operate. And unfortunately, it happens to all of us this way. We're all born creative, and then we go through a left brain education system that just beats the creativity out of us. I'm going to teach you a subject, you have to learn this subject, give me an answer to it, I'm going to grade you on that, let's move on to the next thing. And then you leave academia and you move into your careers, and it's very similar. Only instead of being given tests, you're given projects and performance reviews. And so what we want to try and do with design thinking is tell your left brain to just take a little bit of a rest, and we're going to let the right brain take over now, the creative side of what we do. And we're going to do this because we want to be able to try and invoke the creative sides of ourselves to be able to think of things in a new and different way, to challenge the status quo and to imagine things that maybe weren't there before. And so when we think of design thinking, we think of looking at the opposite, the groups and the organizations and the higher education institutions that just look at things the way they always have been, and that's the way they always should be. We all know people like this. We've always done it this way, and it should always work that way. And there's just a great quote from Mr. Ford. If you always do what you've always done, you'll always get what you've always got. And it's the truth. If you're happy with where you are and you want to keep doing it, continue to do it. The reality of this is that eventually it's going to catch up to you. I mean, at one point, Sears was the big name in retail, General Motors in automobiles, and IBM in mainframe and hard computers and hardware. And they always did what they'd always done, and they eventually got what they've always got. It's just the market around them had changed, and the world changed for them. And a lot of times when we get into this mode, we think we know what's right. We think we know what's so important. We suffer from this concept of educated incapacity. And that is knowing so much about what you know that you lose sight of what is possible. It's almost the too close to the forest to see the trees. You know, all of us could be in IT, we could be in higher ed, we could be in marketing, and sometimes you spend so much time in those fields that you don't realize what has happened outside of them. And you lose sight of what is possible because we're so influenced by what we know and what we do. So I want to take you through an approach that's going to help you get out of that educated incapacity and help you learn things in a different light. And that is basically the design thinking side of things. So let me take you through the design thinking approach. And while Mitch said we have 90 minutes, we're not going to spend 90 minutes on design thinking to teach you the approach. We're going to take you through it at a very high level so you understand what it is, talk through some case studies, and then maybe how you can apply it to what you do. If we had to look up the definition for design thinking, and mind you, if you Google it, you'll see 500 definitions, and they're all probably right in one way, shape, or form. The one that we use is this. Design thinking is a new way of thinking that integrates empathy, creativity, and experimentation to design meaningful solutions for your end users. I want to take a step back. It's a new way of thinking that integrates empathy, creativity, and experimentation to design, the operative word here, meaningful solutions for your end users. We all design solutions. We all solve problems. We all know what we have to deliver. But how meaningful is it for the people that you are designing for? And that's one of the challenges that we run into, especially in higher ed. Because a lot of times, and it's not just limited to this audience, trust me, this is all over higher ed, is that we're constantly putting new things out for students, putting new things out for faculty, coming up with these new ideas for the campus, and really they're just variations on a theme of what we had done before, and the results are something that is not as impressive. I come from the fashion industry. I spent a large part of my career in IT at the Estee Lauder companies and worked with a lot of the finest marketers and sales organizations in the world. And a lot of times when they did a lot of innovation work, as you'll see in many fashion industries or in retail, you'll see a lot of companies come out with new and improved products. When you look at it, you're like, it's really the same thing. You put a new package around it, you put new marketing around it, it's not really that different. What's meaningful to your end users? And it's not just new products we're talking about, but solutions and services as well. So if we had to look at what design thinking was, well, number one, it's human-centered. You're often going to hear people call design thinking human-centered design. It's about a problem that sees things from the eyes of a human being. It interacts with and it affects human beings in one way, shape, or form. And that could be the student, the teacher, the administrator, somebody in another department, can be just about anybody. But it is always human-centered and it's always focused on people. If you want to fix your faucet that's broken, go get the manual and fix the faucet. You don't need to run design thinking for it. But when it's a problem that involves human beings in one way, shape, or form, design thinking can be very effective. Design thinking is innovative. It challenges traditional thinking. It looks for new ways to solve problems. And I always love this quote. This is from Mark Twain. It ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so. Which is so true. There's so many boundaries and assumptions that we make in life that constrain us. We can't do this because I know what the policy is. We can't do this because that's what a classroom looks like. We can't do this because that's not what ITIL will say or ITSM might say. The reality is, a lot of those assumptions are our own, and nobody's ever challenged them, and we just assume that those walls are up for a reason. Well, realistically, it's not what you know, what you don't know that gets you into trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so. And then finally, design thinking is inspiring. It provides a methodology that fuels creative thinking. When people learn design thinking, the things they do after this are magnificent. So it inspires people to learn how to think versus only knowing what to think. And so I'm going to share a video with you now that I hope that plays, so we didn't test this one out. This is Neil deGrasse Tyson, and he is giving a presentation at a presentation. He's giving a commencement exercise at a university, and he talks about the power of knowing how to think versus what to think. One of my colleagues, please let me know if for some reason this is not playing.
So our brains are absent the wiring capable of coming up with an original thought, or thought not previously considered, or thought between the ideas that are already laid on the table. What we're not valuing is knowledge as process rather than knowledge as an answer. In another example, a little contrived, but it brings the point home even a little more strongly. If you're an employer and two candidates come up looking for a job, and this is, again, a contrived example, and you're interviewing the two candidates, and you say, oh, as for part of this interview, I just want to ask you, what's the height of the spire on this building that we're in? And the candidate says, oh, I was an architect. I've majored in architecture for a while, and I memorized the heights of all the buildings on campus. I know the height of that spire is 150 feet. In fact, 155 feet tall. Okay, turns out that's the right answer. That's the right answer. And the person came up with it in seconds. That person goes away, the next candidate walks in. Do you know the height of the spire on this building? The candidate says, no, but I'll be right back. Person runs outside, measures the length of the shadow of that spire on the ground, measures the length of his or her own shadow, ratios the height to the shadows, comes up with a number. Runs back inside, it's about 150 feet. Who are you going to hire? I'm hiring the person who figured it out, even though it took that person longer, even though the person's answer is not as precise. I'm hiring that person because that person knows how to use the mind in a way not previously engaged. You realize when you know how to think, it empowers you far beyond those who know only what to think.
When you know how to think, it empowers you far beyond those who only know what to think. We have plenty of people in this world that know what to think, and unfortunately not enough of people who know how to think. And design thinking is one way that gives you that freedom and the ability to know how to think in a very proven approach. So, I'm going to take you through design thinking. Some of you already know this. Some of you, this is new. And so I'm going to take you through it. This is it. If someone tells you to learn design thinking, go read this book on design thinking, don't ever talk to them about design thinking again. This is it. You don't need a manual. You don't need a black belt in this. You don't need an army of consultants. It's 5 steps. Let me take you through this in about 5 minutes and give you some stories as how this works. The first step in this, as you can see here, is empathize. The first thing you do in design thinking before you try and solve anything is you empathize with the people for whom you are designing. You try and understand what is in their heads and their hearts. You try and get their perspective on things and understand how they see things. We are conditioned as humans that when we are asked a question, we have to give you an answer. And if I gave you a problem right now, immediately you would have an answer in your head whether you liked it or not. It's the way we are conditioned. But in design thinking, the first thing we do is we take a step back, we realize we don't matter here, and we try and understand what's in the heads and the hearts of the people that we are designing for to gain insights. You don't ask them what they want. Another Henry Ford quote, if I asked people what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse. So it's not about asking people what they want because they don't know. But if you gather insights from them and you can piece them together, you can help them. Case in point, first design thinking workshop I ever attended was out at Stanford University at their D School. I was invited as part of an event with 40 other IT executives. We all sat down, tables of 8. We were asked to design the office of the future. Technology executives, we know how to design the office of the future. No cubicles, walls you can write on. We're going to have a room with all innovative, cool stuff like a foosball table and a Lego set so you can be innovative. We're going to have food everywhere, keg parties on Thursdays. We got it. We know how to do this. Why are you bothering us? And he said, okay, now we're going to do this via design thinking. And he sent us out on campus. 2 people at a time. You go out in pairs. And this is very common in design thinking. And we had to go interview students. dressed in sport jacket and slacks, and we're walking around Stanford University campus. First kid we come up to, I say kid because he was, hats on backwards, shorts, t-shirt, flip-flops. We said, hey, can we ask you a question with the D school? He said, sure. What do you think the office of the future ought to look like? Which, by the way, is the wrong question to ask, but anyway. What do you think the office of the future ought to look like? He said, office. I'm not working in an office. I'll work out of my apartment. I'll work at the park, at Starbucks. I'm not working in an office. I know I have to visit clients, but I'm not working in an office. Okay, thanks. We go to the next student, girl coming out of a building. We ask her the same question. What do you think the office of the future ought to look like? She said, and she gave this some thought, well, I believe in giving back to the community, so I would like to make sure wherever I work that they were located in a depressed part of the city, that they gave us time to give back to others, to donate our time and our resources, we're ecologically friendly. Okay, thank you. We go to the last group, it's 6 exchange students from Singapore. What do you think the office of the future ought to look like? They said, oh, we love your dorm rooms. And we said, well, that's great that you love our dorm rooms, but what do you think the office of the future ought to look like? And they said, well, that's exactly it. When we're in our dorm rooms together, we feed off of each other's energy. And if it's 2 o'clock in the morning and somebody has an idea, we get some pizza and we start talking and working. We want that camaraderie wherever we work. I said, okay, thank you. And we go back to our room and we realized we had no idea what the office of the future ought to look like. Turns out the other 38 executives that were there, same thing. We had no idea. We did not know what our end users wanted because we thought we knew everything. Which kind of leads us to the second step, which is define. Now that I've done my empathy work, and now that I know what's in the heads and the hearts of the people that I'm designing for, what is the real problem that I have to solve? And that's what we do in define. If I know what's in their heads and hearts, what's the real problem to solve at this point? And it turns out building the new office of the future wasn't the real problem. The real problem was, how might I build an experience that would attract millennials to come work for my company? So we would have gone out and spent millions of dollars designing this beautiful new office based on what we think, and it wouldn't have done a thing for what we were trying to accomplish. And that happens all too often. We solve the wrong problem because we think we know what the issue is. Once you've defined the problem and now you know what it is to solve, then and only then do you move into the ideate stage, which is when you come up with potential solutions. This step is where most organizations start. They start at ideate. They start innovating. And there's nothing wrong with that. However, look what you don't know by starting there. You don't really know what's in the heads and the hearts or the perspective of your end users, and you don't know what the real problem is to solve. So you're ideating, you come up with as many cool solutions as you possibly can. You're coming up with different ideas. You're challenging the status quo, coming up with things that haven't been invented yet, but you're coming up with a wide variety of possible solutions. Another differentiating factor then for design thinking is you prototype your solution. If I tell you, I have this great idea, let me tell you what it is, and I start explaining it to you, what I'm saying and picturing in my mind could be very different than what you're hearing and picturing in yours. And so you might say, I think that's a great idea, let's go do it. And then we would go ahead and do that, and it turns out that, in fact, we weren't talking about the same thing, and I'll develop it, I'll put it in front of you, and you might say, I don't know why you did that, that wasn't what I was thinking I wanted. So what you do in design thinking is you build a prototype. You build a tangible representation of your idea. Now, when people in IT hear prototype, they think working model, that if it's okay, we can roll it out. Prototype in design thinking, it's like art school. Construction paper, glue, popsicle sticks, tape, glitter, poster board. You're building a crude representation of your idea. You want people to know that it's just in development stages. It's not finalized, so you can change it. So you take this prototype and go to the last step, which is test. And that is, now that I have my prototype, I'm going to bring it out to end users, potential end users, show it to them, and get their feedback. Here's my idea. Here's what it does. What do you think? And don't oversell it. Don't over-orchestrate it. Watch how they interact with the prototype to come back and say, I like this idea, but I don't understand why you're doing this. Or I like the idea, but what about if we also did this? Or, I hate the idea. So if they're giving you good feedback and they give you some good information, you go back to prototype and you iterate your prototype. You make changes, you bring it back out, and you keep doing this until you get to a point where there's buy-in on your idea. If they say, I hate this idea, and everybody says it, you don't reiterate your prototype. Maybe you go back to ideate and you try a different solution. And if they still hate it and they keep hating it, maybe you have to go back to define to see if you had the right problem. That is design thinking, and you are all now design thinkers. Congratulations. But it's kind of like me telling you, well, here's how you play golf. Here's a golf ball, here's a golf club. Just take the club, hit the ball, and put it in the hole 425 yards away. Now you're all golfers. Well, you are, but you learn it by doing it. You learn it by experiencing it and practicing it. And that's the same thing here. It's one thing to learn what design thinking is. It's another thing to actually do it. So, very famous story about design thinking, the GE MRI story. So years ago, a gentleman named Doug Dietz was heading up the MRI program at General Electric. Had access to the best engineers in the world, best R&D facilities, great resources, and he was tasked with building a new MRI machine for children. It's a great TED Talk on this that Doug Dietz actually gives. It's wonderful. And he goes ahead and he builds this MRI machine, and it is spectacular. Great engineering, great results, much better than the previous ones. They're patting themselves on the back. They did a great job. So Doug goes out and he goes and field tests this in some hospitals and talks to some of the clinicians. And he wants to see how things are going with that. So he goes to a hospital, talks to a clinician. How's the MRI machine working? Oh, it's working really well. It's doing a really good job. And they go through a lot of the technical details and experiences. And again, he's feeling really great about this. Doug then notices with the clinician 2 parents walking down the hall with a child. And the child is hysterically screaming, please don't make me do this. I'm scared. I don't want to go in there. Don't make me go in there. The mother and the father are trying to calm the child down. It's not going to hurt you. It's just to take pictures so we can give you medicine and make you better. I don't want to go in there. They bring the child in the room kicking and screaming. Please don't make me go in there. Child is hysterical. This is a very common scenario with children, apparently, if you've ever seen it. MRIs are daunting experiences for adults, let alone children. And the kid is continuing to fuss over this. The mother is getting all concerned. The father is distraught. And finally, they look over the clinician and they have to make the call. They call the anesthesiologist who comes down. They have to anesthetize the child, strap the child in, and get the MRI machine. And Doug's kind of upset over all of this. And he looks at this and he said, well, how often does this happen? Is this just an exception? He said 8 or 9 times out of 10. And Doug is completely distraught that this is happening because the child has to get anesthetized. The experience for the parents and the child is terrible. The MRI is not going to be as accurate with the child anesthetized, more than likely. And he realized that he didn't succeed in the way that he needed to. He almost failed in that regard. So Doug goes back, tries to figure out how he can do this a little bit better. And he goes through the same process we just talked about. Takes his team out to Stanford. They go through a boot camp and they do their empathy work. They talk to child psychologists, to parents, to children, to doctors, to nurses, clinicians, people that work in the hospital. They do all of their empathy work. They understand what the problem is to solve. They figure out what the real problem is here, ideate solutions, prototype, and test them. And this is what they come up with. The one on the left, which I believe is a CAT scan, is a pirate ship. The one on the right is an MRI machine that represents cable cars. The one I'm not showing you here is a pirate ship. And they made a room up to look like a pirate ship, and they told the children, we're going to take you on a ride. You're going to pilot a new spaceship. And if you can get that spaceship to the other end of the galaxy, we're going to give you a prize. But to do that, you've got to remain really still. And you're going to know you're going fast because you're going to hear these loud banging noises that you normally hear in an MRI machine. These loud banging noises, that means your engines are firing. So they went ahead and did this. And what did they find? The 8 or 9 out of 10 dropped dramatically to a much lower number. The anesthesiologist didn't need to come in. They could use their time in places they were needed. The costs went down for hospitals. The MRIs were better. The parents weren't distraught. It was a better experience for everybody. And a knockoff side effect was the children asked to go back on again because they got their prizes and they were capturing it. It was all about the experience. But design thinking brought that out. It wasn't about the technology. The problem was the experience. So, how is design thinking different than traditional thinking? The first thing is, like I said before, it's about understanding the needs and perspectives of the end user before you jump to a solution. It's all about empathy. It's not about you. It's about taking a breath, slowing down, and before I try and solve this, empathize with the end user and find out what is in their heads and their hearts. What is it that they need? Great way of looking at empathy is a quote by Roman Krasnarek. Empathy is the art of stepping imaginatively into the shoes of another person, understanding their feelings and perspectives, and using that understanding to guide your actions. Empathy is not sympathy. They're two different things. But when you can step imaginatively into the shoes of someone else and understand their feelings and perspectives, it's magical. The last part of this sentence is what's really important. Then using that to guide your actions. I've seen a lot of people in IT departments especially say, yeah, we know what our business partners want. We empathize with them all the time, but then they do what they were originally going to do anyway. Well, what's the point of empathy at that point? So try and empathize and use what you learn in empathy to guide your actions. When you empathize, there's 3 different ways that you can do it. You can observe people. If you're creating a new personal device like a phone, you can go ahead and observe people and just watch how they interact with things. How do people operate in a park? How do children sit in classrooms? You can immerse yourself in the experience. Do it yourself. There was a famous story of a hospital where people were complaining about the cough medicine that they got and where it came in the process. They put a team together. First thing they did, everybody had to take the cough medicine. See things from the experience yourself. Be a customer of an organization. Sit in a classroom if you're in a university. Work with administrators on putting a budget together or a plan together. See things from their eyes. And the last one on the bottom is engage. Talk to people. Don't ask them what they want, but talk to them. Tell me about your experiences in education. What did you like the best? Tell me more about that. Tell me a little bit about why, when we're talking about service management, tell me about how you use the service management system. Tell me about what your most positive experience was. Why was that? What's your most negative experience? Tell me a little bit more about that. Get people to tell you stories, because when you put all these stories together, you get insights, and those insights are then what you can use to come up with a solution. Design thinking is different by inspiring creativity and risk-taking, meaning taking chances, encouraging asking the right questions versus just giving the right answers. I work with the people at Stony Brook University in New York on design thinking fairly often. Originally, we were going to put a class together. And the gentleman I was working with at the time, I had to write curriculum I'd never done before, syllabi, and I had to put in there a grading rubric. And one of the things that I told the people that I was doing was, you know something, this is not about them getting a test right. They might fail and actually succeed here. And their heads exploded when I said that. And so they weren't able to do anything around this. But if you can ask the right questions, you're going to get to the right answers. Design thinking is about constantly exploring, taking chances, being creative, and not just jumping right back to the status quo. Peter Drucker, the manager who comes up with the right solution to the wrong problem, is more dangerous than the manager who comes up with the wrong solution to the right problem. What is the real problem that you are trying to solve? If you figure it out right, but you have the wrong solution, you'll get the right solution eventually. But if you have the wrong problem, which oftentimes we do, we're going to spend a lot of time just trying to fix that problem, and it's not going to move the needle at all. And lastly, design thinking is different by taking action on ideas, promoting experimentation and iteration, and accepting fast failure. This is a key part of design thinking. You have to be able to fail. There's a very famous design firm in Palo Alto called IDEO. And IDEO, and their global company, they're one of the most fascinating design firms in the world. One of the expressions they use there is fail fast to succeed sooner. Fail fast, they almost encourage failure. And you can think back to your own careers and your own lives. The times you fail, you never make that mistake again, and you learn from it, and you can help move mountains in another direction. So design thinking is about building these prototypes, being okay to fail, and iterating until you finally get the best solution for anyone that you can. So that's design thinking in a nutshell. There's obviously much more depth in each one of the steps and how you do things and why you do things. But that was your 25-minute overview about the process, those 5 steps of design thinking, from empathy all the way through testing, why it's a little bit different, and how it can be used and how it has been used in industry. With the most important takeaway being, don't just try and solve the problem. First, empathize with what is in the heads and the hearts of the people you're designing for. Figure out what the real problem is you're solving. Then come up with some really wild and crazy ideas to solve this. Prototype and test them to see if the people you're designing for agree. So let's take a look a little bit further with some of your colleagues. And oh, I'm sorry, there was a quote. I missed the quote. Mr. Jobs, when you're a consultant, I think it's mandatory that you have to use a Steve Jobs quote, so I had to put one in here, but it's actually an excellent quote. A lot of times people don't know what they want until you show it to them. And it's so true when you think about what he did at Apple, what he did at Next, what he did everywhere he went. He was always about, I don't ask people what they want, a little like the Henry Ford quote, but once you show it to them, they seem to want it. I mean, just look at, I don't want to talk about iPhone 14. I won't say anything. I'm an Apple guy, so I usually am the one who dives into those things. But sometimes you don't realize you need these things until you see them, and then you think you do. So I want to turn this over now to my friend, Mr. Stephen Ackerson from St. Thomas, Minnesota, not Caribbean, as we talked about. We had to ask that. And let Steve talk to you a little bit about some of the things they're doing with design thinking at the University of St. Thomas. Steve?
Thanks, Jeff. So you can go to that next slide, please. So I'm going to actually start with this sketch from another Jeff, a man named Jeff Patton, from his book on user story mapping. And the people that I work with most closely have seen this too many times and are tired of it. But I just love this diagram because I think in 4 frames, it really illustrates the most important part of any design thinking initiative and probably any initiative. And that's really kind of relentlessly building shared understanding. So we build this understanding through our cross-functional collaboration, through, as Jeff noted, asking those right questions, by being completely transparent is hugely important, and just making everything as concrete and as visual as possible. So I see all that right there, and that I hope the examples that I give today will illustrate how we try to put our ideas of shared understanding into practice at St. Thomas. So we'll start with that. Next slide, please. So I am going to try to give some concrete examples to the steps in the phases that Jeff talked about. And I'm going to really use references to 2 recent design thinking workshops that I've had the pleasure to lead at St. Thomas. In one, we explored the student experience with remote learning during the pandemic. And our current one that we are just moving beyond the ideate stage is to better understand our prospects college selection journey, especially focusing on underrepresented in what we call our low yield populations, students of color, first generation students, and for us, it's outstate students. So both these efforts started similarly. We worked with leadership to frame the perceived problem. What's the perceived problem we're trying to solve? So as Jeff said, sometimes the perceived problem isn't the real problem. And so we would create a problem or opportunity statement. We then tweak this and again, build a shared understanding of what we think is the problem or opportunity. And we'd refine those until we kind of get to that 4th frame in that cartoon. It says, I'm glad we all agree on this. I'm glad we all agree what we think the problem is. We then translate these into what we call design challenge questions. And those become our touchstone for the entire project. So these, we come back to them often. We update them as we learn new things. But these are our 2 design challenges from those 2 initiatives. So take a second to read through those and jump if you have any questions or comments about those. I do think you'll agree that they're fairly meaty challenges. Jeff was mentioning the design firm, in IDEO. So one of the things they talked about in a good design challenge is broad enough to yield surprises, but narrow enough to provide focus. And that's where we try to kind of hit that mark. So we again, we start with this well-defined problem, what we think is a well-defined perceived problem, and build a shared understanding around that. So I'm going to share some, okay, just next slide, please. Sorry. So I'm going to share some examples and some of the tools that we use to do that. You'll see on the right-hand side there, this is problem or opportunity definition statement. So again, this is about asking the right questions. So we ask questions about what's happening today. What would you like to see in the future? Why is solving this important? So we start engaging our stakeholders right away with those kinds of questions to just identify the perceived problem. Then during that stage, during the empathy stage, we plan our teams, our research approach, and we execute it. So on our current project, the enrollment project, we started with a small cross-functional team. We had one person from enrollment, one person from marketing. So again, cross-functional, 2 people from our IT group. And then we had 5 brilliant students. So I'm going to mention some best practices that we've learned over the last several years doing design thinking workshops. And that's probably number 1, involve students. We hire students. We treat them as our paid consultants. We carefully recruit them. So we're getting really the very involved, very, very bright students. And that has been so huge throughout all of our projects. So our core teams, we've also learned, really need to do the bulk of the work. Everyone's super busy, particularly when you start getting the leadership levels and our stakeholder levels. So we have really focused on these small core teams to do the bulk of the work throughout this entire process. And then we bring it back to our stakeholder teams. So for our enrollment project, just to give you some examples during empathy. So we narrowed our focus right away to our different personas. In this case, we ended up going, we want the low yield students that we're really having difficult times attracting. And as I said, that's BIPOC first generation out-of-state students. Our research approach we talked about, both of these projects we did student-led and in pairs, as Jeff mentioned, empathy interviews. We developed what we think were really good, deep, open-ended questions and follow-up questions. Recruiting was a challenge, particularly on the prospective one, and I don't underestimate that. So with prospective students, we had to deal with all kinds of things from segment the data, getting the right data, student data privacy, incentives. So, which was strange, we wanted to offer incentives, but they could potentially come to St. Thomas. And then we had they would be employees and be getting like dollars in kind. So we had all kinds of things, but we worked through all those very, very differently. The pandemic, our remote learning one, people were happy to talk to us. I mean, we had to basically say we've got enough, because everyone wanted to talk to us about their experience with online learning, remote learning during the pandemic. So another tool we would do is we actually, as a team, we started drafting what do we call it, these persona themes. So if you look at the example on the slide here, it's hard to see, but we wanted to say, what do we want to discover? So I'll just kind of read pieces of that. So we'd say, what are the segments we're looking at? What are the characteristics of that? So in this case, as I told you, BIPOC first generation. What are behaviors and beliefs we want to dig into? So we asked things like, we wanted to ask things about what are the steps you take during your exploration processes. We wanted to ask questions about the tools and resources they use. We wanted to ask questions about their motivations, their needs. What do you expect for next year? What are some of the things that were most frustrating during your process? We asked about their biggest challenges and obstacles. And so this was for us just to start framing our questions. And you'll see, again, we're going to come back to these personas later. So then the students would go out and interview we got kind of through all this research planning. We got our notes out to prospects. We segmented our lists. We had our students conduct the interviews. They would then bring the interview data back to our core team, and they would share the results with us. And we used a mural board. I don't know if people are familiar with Mural, but it's just an awesome place just to do it's a whiteboarding tool where you can do collaboration put cards on there. So we would capture all our data on that. And so the students would share, and we would write down headline statements and post it on this board. I'll mention one other best practice that we have kind of used over the years. Each time we discover a new tool or we have kind of a new template that really worked well for us, we've been kind of capturing those. We put together a best practice guidebook that we have been sharing across the university. So we have probably a 40, 50 page best practice guidebook that has all of our tools, all of we considered what really worked well for us. Everything from how to select a good team to how to actually ideate, how to do a good brainstorming session. So next, please. So the define phase, that's really about making meaning from our data. So as I mentioned, we had a mural board. We had different colors to represent our different personas, our tentative personas. And then what we do on that board is once we had a lot of data on there, we'd start grouping stuff into like ideas. We would start moving stuff into themes and sub-themes. We would then, once we had our themes identified, we'd craft what are called insight statements off kind of those major themes. And then we would basically translate those insight statements into how might we questions. And that's very abstract. I'll give you some concrete examples of that. But the whole idea of an insight statement is it's really a concise statement that captures a really unmet need that we heard about, kind of the context behind it and why it's important. And so my goal and our goal is always when we capture these insight statements is we want the reaction to be, we need to do something about this, that this captured something that we should be doing something about. Then the how might we questions are basically, we're just taking and reframing that statement in a way that when we answer it, it's going to point to possible solutions. So again, we do most of this work in our core team. We're extremely transparent. We share all our meeting minutes. We share all of our tools. People can go out there anytime and look at what we're doing, but we only have our stakeholders meet a few times because we found that they've told us they can't meet more often. So we get them together once in a while, and they're really about validating our work, revising our work, and in the end, they're making the final decisions. So next, please. So this is an example from our most recent project, from our enrollment project. So it just gives you an example of, we identified a big theme around diversity. And a lot of our students were expressing, our students of color were expressing concerns about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And not just at St. Thomas, but that was really a big part of their selection process. And the appreciative of colleges that did that well, or seemed to do that well, and had initiatives around that, really seemed to be walking the walk and talking the talk. So once we had the themes, we create this insight statement. And here's just an example of the insight statement. One of our insight statements from this recent initiative, and it's BIPOC prospects need assurances that the school they choose embodies DEI, accessible sources that it's practiced and lived on campus. Heard that in many, many different ways, but it was a very, very consistent message. And then that other tool that we used here on the right there is, as I said, we asked questions around beliefs and attitudes, challenges, and pain. We took those questions and we took our big themes and we tried to create this one pager that we would help build shared understanding across other audiences. And this was an example of our persona statement for our BIPOC students. What was most important to them? What were some of the key behaviors that we heard about as part of their enrollment practices or their looking for college practices? What were some beliefs and attitudes they had, and so on? So we try to capture them all here. Next slide, please. And then here's a very similar example from our other project, so the remote learning project. So we have on the left here, we have our data and our themes and sub-themes. And then on the right, you see our insights that we heard over and over again, that students, particularly in the pandemic, craved opportunities to engage and work with other students. Without this, they lost focus, interest, felt disconnected, and learned less. We heard that over and over and over again. And so we flipped that to a question. How might we ensure all of our courses include opportunities for students to learn, work, and study together? Next, please. I will mention on that one, kind of another best practice is, just as I said, our best practice has been to have paid consultants, our student workers as really consultants on our project. It also has been best practice to have them present back to our stakeholders. The more you have things in the voice of the students, the more powerful it has been every single time. So this next stage, the ideate phase. So this is now trying to, we've heard, oh, and I also mentioned too, so, we talked about kind of our problem statement or opportunity statement. So design thinking is both about problem solving, but it's also about problem finding. So oftentimes as we're doing this, we're finding new problems that actually end up we want to solve those almost more than the originating problem. So during the ideate phase is answering those how might we questions. So we have in both these projects just used structured brainstorming to answer those questions. So our core team usually starts things out, and we're looking, if you look at this Venn diagram, as a core team, we're typically looking, our students are looking around desirability. Do students want and need this? But then we bring it back to the stakeholders. and we say, okay, they help us pick what we think are the kind of key, how might we questions that we want to answer, some of those key insights that we want to address. And then once we have those prioritized, then we say, let's do this brainstorming session. Let's look at potential solutions. And they help us then just brainstorm those lists of solutions, and we bring it back to them and say, okay, we already listed some that we think are really desirable from a student perspective. Help us kind of rein this in now and say, what are the ones that we also say are feasible? Can we do it? Are viable? Should we do it? And let's find that sweet spot. We've also tried to find this, we found in past projects, if you can find kind of that sweet spot, but something that you can do quickly, that's kind of that quick hit idea, we try to do that so we can show impact right away. I'm going to stop there. I'm not going to get a lot into the prototype and test piece, but I will mention that we have had a lot of successes over the years, some small, some much bigger, based on workshops that we've done. I'll just mention a couple examples. So we did a whole registration one on a registration system where we revamped our registration process and systems. It was all based on students' feedback and watching students actually try to register for courses, interviewing students about that. We actually had a brand new student app that spun from a workshop that was designed specifically to build the student app. So we actually did the journey of a day and a week in the life of students. And so it was asking students, what's most important? What are things you need to do often? What things would you like to be able to get your hands on right away? We literally built the app around their answers.
Hey, Steve, Nick has a question when you started to talk about asking the right questions. So how do you suggest practicing the such that you learn and can help others learn when the right or wrong questions are, what the right or wrong questions are? Are you referring to like backing away from solutions to reveal the real job to be done?
Yeah, I think that's a good part of it. Try to avoid questions that point directly to a solution or that have a solution almost embedded in the question. So we try to start with very, very broad, open-ended questions. That's why I like the idea of that tentative persona to start things out. So we start out with that document and say, what are the kinds of things we're hoping to learn? And if it's about, what are your challenges as you're trying to select a college? That's so broad that you can get a lot from that. You're not suggesting a solution. You're actually just asking big, broad questions. And then we typically, once we ask those big, broad questions, we'll have some follow-up questions for the students just in case it doesn't seem to go anywhere. I don't know if I answered that or not, but it's a real art asking good questions, and we try to do open-ended questions that are going to yield the types of answers that we're hoping to get based on that original tentative persona and tied to our design challenge.
Yeah, Steve, let me just jump in here.
Yeah.
Also. This is such a crucial part of the entire design thinking process, and one of the things that we spend a lot of time on in workshops, because it's not a normal thing for people to do, to figure out how do I ask the right questions. And so a lot of times you do something that is called a discussion guide, where you try and first thing you do is you think about, well, what are the types of questions we would want to ask? And you get 10 or 15 of those as a group. And then you boil that down into certain themes. And then you boil that down into a few questions that you might have. And you think that you're asking the right thing. The best thing to do is to start asking those questions. And then regrouping as a team when you're done with that to see, well, what have we learned? And then you'll find out really quick, are these getting us the answers that we want? Are they off base? Do we need to add some? How are we doing relative to the questions that we're asking? And then maybe reformulate the questions to go after a different aspect of it, or change it so you're getting more along the lines of what you were looking for. So a lot of this is very much trial and error. And remember, this is not a do step one, then do step two, then do step three. It's very freeform. This is an art form. And so there is no right question per se, but is it getting you the insights that you want towards the goal that you're trying to reach? And then potentially changing that or revisiting it. So when you're doing this empathy work, you do it and you change going forward. Remember, empathy isn't done in an hour. It could take days, it could take weeks. It depends on how much time and effort that you want to do with this, and you can always course correct as you go forward.
So actually, Kat has a good follow-up, if you don't mind. She's asking, how do you keep stakeholders' personal agendas out of forming those questions? In other words, how do you keep it open-ended without being leading?
I'll start with what's worked for us. And as I said, it's been great to have this small core team. And so we've had people who've now been through several of these workshops. And when we start with that tentative persona document that gets to the areas that we're really hoping to explore, we write the first questions, and we bring them back to our stakeholders, but by starting with what we think are really solid questions that we work on, we spend hours on trying to get right, we bring them to the stakeholders. We haven't had too much an issue when we do it that way with kind of having other notions brought into the questions. People are pretty generally happy when we say, yeah, these are pretty solid questions for getting at what we think is the perceived problem or the perceived opportunity we're trying to address.
Patty has a question about staffing resource model for students, using students in these projects. So do the staff members involved have other responsibilities, or do you have a team dedicated to design UX? If organizationally sit outside of IT, do you offer support to your IT department as a service? She's just trying to get an understanding of the resource model.
Well, a resource model. So IT at our university has been kind of leading this model since the beginning. We have done very cross-functional type things, as you can see. So what's the staff members look like for students and staff? So I'll tell you my recruiting secret for students. I have learned that the best place to go is to look for students who are candidates for student government, because they already have shown that they want to be involved in the campus. And I've really found that they're great candidates. I've also looked for students involved in the entrepreneurial program, because some of them actually have had design thinking courses.
What about working
as far as staff is concerned, it's really working with our leadership teams. I mean, fortunately for the last two we've done, our provost came and said, my 3 top priorities are enrollment. And he wants our teams to work on this together. So almost by default, we had permission to put together a pretty high-powered team.
Do you find you're successful if you work with faculty on like offering extra credit or some sort of incentive for their student to participate?
For the students are paid.
Okay. So it's not
so
free.
That's been key. We pay the students. This is their job. So they literally, I literally treat them as consultants. To tell them to bill like lawyers.
All right. Someone's asking too, how do you get a similar question to the leading, not ensuring you don't get leading questions. How do you get the stakeholders to put aside their preconceived solutions, right? Because in IT, we're really good about jumping right to a solution first.
That's really hard. You'll maybe notice that on that slide, their potential solution slide, our 7 rules for brainstorming. So I don't know if this fully gets to that, but we at least try to engage people and say, hey, we're trying to do this structured brainstorming that does generate a lot of ideas, and that there is no dumb ideas. In fact, wild ideas are encouraged, and that we can build on others' ideas through things like yes and not saying that's a dumb idea. So it's really kind of saying, hey, we got some rules around doing this well. So that has been helpful, sharing those rules up front. And it's also helpful that our core team has done a little bit of it too, to kind of show some of the creativity that can be brought forth by using a structured approach like that.
Well, thank you everyone for the questions. I think it's time to move into Susan's case study.
Yep, absolutely. I'll close with this before we pass to Susan, that I didn't talk about the prototype test pieces, but we're really actually excited about this one because we're hoping to take some of our potential solutions that move to the top and forming this idea of a product or service team to really iterate solutions to that. So we're kind of tying in Scrum with the whole prototype test piece of this model. So on to Susan.
Okay, thank you, Mitch and Steve. And yeah, I just want to make sure that we address all these great questions that we're getting. So thank you. And what I would like to also highlight something that Steve had mentioned is about the students. So I'm going to have a short talk about my experience with academic libraries. So I feel that I'm in a lucky spot because people come to the library with either that they need help or they have a problem. So I talk to hundreds of students a day, faculty, staff, administration, and the library is really a hub of questions. So the main main issue that we have in libraries is about improving the usability of library databases. And I've been in academic libraries over 15 years. And just a little bit of the background is that we really need, libraries must continue to learn and understand user behavior. And sometimes it's difficult. How do we assess service access points? Every day I'm learning from the students, right? When they come to me with an issue, or I cannot find this information, or I'm trying to do some research, and I always ask, show me, how are you doing this? And I learn something new every day. So that's how I was introduced to design thinking many years ago, and it always seems like I'm in the empathy and ideate stages because of the nature of our work. So in higher ed, many of you in higher ed know that we're no longer dealing with the traditional student, that we must create different personas, something that Steve had mentioned before. We're working with iGen students that are coming back, the adult students that are coming back to school after raising their families. So just want to make sure that we're offering the right services and the products for each. So I think I went through the second slide. Okay, then there was another, just a summary, a little bit of the background. So now to apply design thinking, I applied a design thinking approach to think of finding solution to increasing and facilitating the use of library resources, specifically online databases. So from a librarian's perspective, we say, oh, you just search and it's easy. However, navigating the databases is challenging because we have several different products. We have here sometimes hundreds of different databases from different vendors. So there's different interfaces, and how do we have that come together? So, and many people and students especially are finding information from other sources, from other internet resources. So when you're finding information from outside of the databases, like these scholarly resources, there's a lot of valid information that's freely available. So one question is the information good enough, just good enough? Does it need to be information from these databases? But one approach is to find, again, our current problem is how do we increase the use and facilitate the use of library resources. So next slide is the problem. The main problem is the time and the effectiveness. So again, we subscribe to several databases. These databases are expensive. So libraries, we are not income producing. We're always spending money. So that's an issue as an administrator. And I'm sorry, no one keeps hearing these notifications through this presentation. But okay, so our users, they're comprised of students, faculty, staff, and I'm sorry. I just want to shut off the notifications. I don't know if you keep
Take your time,
them.
Susan. Yeah, we can hear them. We can hear them.
Oh, you can hear them.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah, take your time.
We just happen to have, okay, and all of you in higher ed can just give me a moment. Let me just mute this for a second. Can sympathize with me. They decided to have a full faculty meeting at this moment. So
There you go, Susan. I don't know if you saw that. Right-click the offending tab and click mute site. Thanks, Jeffrey.
Okay, so let me continue. So right now, let's just wrap it up. So the time that it takes to search, and also the effectiveness of the resources and the process. And just this morning, Monday morning, first thing, I walk in and I find out that there's an issue with the databases. So there's usually like levels of security to access a variety of resources from these different vendors. One of our security measures, the easy proxy, was off, so we had to change the code, but what have you. There are just so many different elements or nuances with these library resources. So one thing I thought was important is that after trying to help a student, after the third or fourth screen to narrow down a search, when they're doing their research, users become overwhelmed and they feel that the database is just taking too much time. So, so the next slide is, certain areas to explore. Is the problem the vendor? Or just different questions that I'm always asking, or that we need to ask. So are librarians the issue and the instruction delivery? Do we need to maybe alter the way we're teaching research? And again, how do we increase the use of library resources? And the one thing that I always question is that librarians, we've had decades of research about human-computer interaction. How do people search for information? How do they retrieve information? But it just seems like we're behind in understanding our users. So, and the current view is that library databases are not giving users what they want, which is fast results and simple interfaces. But is that the case? So a few conclusions is that design thinking principles can be used to find solution to address this persistent issue. Okay, empathy really can uncover insights into how library users need and navigate information. And like I had mentioned before, when working with users, I learn something new every day. So, and then we also, again, need to explore our teaching practices and find creative solutions for product improvements, instructional tools, and to just keep understanding our users. And the way to do that is, I believe Steve had mentioned, Jeff had mentioned, is to just keep involving our users by insights, getting feedback, open-ended questions, and just really learning from our users. So I am going to hand this over to Jeff. And again, I apologize, all those little pop-ups at the perfect time. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Steve. It's always helpful when you hear about design thinking to get some real life examples from people who are in your situation. And I think Steve and Susan both did a great job of illustrating that for you. I was just looking at the chat, and I don't know you, Nick Roberts, but that was the best chat response was, how might we disable notifications from faculty? Great design thinking challenge. I like that idea. I don't work with faculty, but I could hear what was going on. I sympathize with you. So let's just wrap this up by just talking a little bit about design thinking in higher education.
Hey, Jeff, can we do, it's a great question. I think that would end the case studies, and then maybe you're going to address it here. So the question came in is, that good question about how to get started with design thinking, especially when it's new for your campus or new for most organizations, right?
Yeah, I'm going
to touch on that.
I'll make sure I touch on that. There was also a question about how do you use this for services rather than creating new products. So I'm going to try and incorporate both of these. Yeah,
right,
yeah, and actually, this is more about services than it is about product in my mind. So we'll get to that. I'll make sure I cover that. So the first thing about design thinking is in education is this is about considering student and faculty perspectives, needs, and insights before you develop a solution. I think there was a question in there about how do you get people's preconceived notions removed from this. It's really hard. The people who you're talking to and you're interviewing, you don't have a chance. They're going to tell you what they're going to tell you, but that's important. But getting you to remember not to ask questions in a leading way, getting you to be able to not jump to a solution, not use your own bias, experience, and beliefs to influence questions or solutions is really difficult. And when we run workshops, a lot of times we have to keep reminding people, take yourself out of the equation. This is not about you. Because unfortunately, this is what most organizations do, is they think they know what everybody wants based on what they know, because this is the educated incapacity again. They're the experts in there. So it's really hard to do, and the biggest recommendation I can make for that is know that it's happening and try and remind people to pull themselves out of it. But that's what this one is about. It's about considering those perspectives, needs, and insights before you develop a solution. So if you think about traditional thinking, it's mostly an internal focus. Look at reviewing research and data, maintaining the status quo, prioritizing policy and procedure, avoiding risk and failure. If we're talking about service management, it's about, well, how do we do things in the past? What's the best practice with the software solution we have? What's the best practice that ITIL will recommend, et cetera? And using that as a starting point, saying, okay, we go from there. And what I'm saying to you with design thinking is you wipe that out. And there was something on the empathy slide that at the bottom it says, think as if you're a child seeing something for the very first time. If you didn't know anything about IT or about service management or about higher ed or about your users, how would you design this? And it would probably be very different than if you did it with what you know. And that's the constraints that we operate, that we think that we have to do things a certain way when in fact you don't. So if that's traditional thinking, when you think of design thinking, the focus is not on us and what we think and know, but more on the external side of things, the people we're designing for. Understanding their perspectives, encouraging new and innovative thinking. It's a good thing. Prioritizing their benefits. This is about them. What they can benefit from is the most important thing, not what's important for us. And then lastly, challenging the status quo for student and faculty benefit. You could say this is for IT benefit, administrative benefit, community benefit, any benefit. Challenge the status quo. And there's a video we're going to end up with today that's going to explain more about what that means. You move when you do this from a left brain, answer-driven traditional response, which, and I'm an IT lifer, I can say this, that kind of sums up IT, to a right brain, growth-oriented, meaningful solution. That defines modern IT or innovative IT. Those people who are always trying to think of new and innovative things, ways to do things, who sometimes get shot down because it doesn't fit with what you're already doing. And that's the point of design thinking, is to break out of that box. It can impact education by focusing on qualitative change rather than quantitative results. This is not about the metrics that you have. This is not about making sure that we're getting our numbers in place and giving those answers. Not that those things aren't important. This is about qualitative change and leading that. This is what design thinking workshops look like. If you Google them, you can see Post-its everywhere. You're going to see people smiling, people collaborating, interacting. The beauty of design thinking is because your right brain takes over, you forget about hierarchy, title, office, and you have people. I've had situations where I had the dean of a business school and an incoming freshman on the team, and that incoming freshman was nervous when we started. By the end, they were working with each other like they had grown up together. It takes out all inhibitions because your right brain doesn't think about hierarchy, and it allows things to go. And you watch in design thinking workshops how well people collaborate with each other. Someone had asked, how do we get this started in our organization, whether it's a college campus, a pharmaceutical company, or a hospitality organization? You do it by trying it, by inviting people to experience it, and by them seeing it. You can't describe this to someone and say, hey, you have to try this, because a lot of times they're going to find a reason not to, because of some other thing that they have to do. I've done this with organizations, and it really emanated from IT, where they brought a lot of their business partners in, a lot of the stakeholders in, and they ran a design thinking workshop around a challenge. We did this at Stony Brook University. We ran a challenge about building, I think it was a 21st century learning experience at the university, and we brought faculty and students and administrators together, and it was a one-day workshop. They ran it, they did it, and they saw the potential, and that's how they got excited. People get excited about design thinking if either they're innovative and inquisitive by nature and want to learn something new, doesn't always fit the academic role necessarily, or they experience it themselves and see things. That's what gets them excited with those things. But you can hold design thinking workshops, and this is why I was laughing at the comment in the chat. They all start with how might we? And so when you're looking at some sample examples, how might we redesign learning environments to better meet student needs? How might we develop and embed entrepreneurship education to promote next generation entrepreneurs in all sectors? You can run these around anything that is a challenge for student and faculty benefit. Or to improve educational experiences, how might we redesign our schools to elevate student engagement and academic outcomes? How might we create a 21st century learning experience at our university? Qualitative change in all of these. And the beauty of each one of these is that in design thinking, you don't just solve for these. You start with these. And remember, in define, you get to reframe the challenge, because after you do your empathy work, you learn that maybe that's not the real problem. This is the real problem that may solve for that. And then finally, by creating exceptional customer engagement and experiences. Your customers, the customers who are called faculty, the customers who are called staff, the faculty, the customers who are your students. You can do this as a partnership by inviting them into the experience. You know, this looks a little agile-ish, right? Inviting customers into the development experience, but this isn't software or solution development. This is about coming up with new experiences and new ideas. It's about customer experience, designing positive experiences for your internal and your external customers. Innovative solutions, creating something new and exciting that surprise and delight your customers. And when we talk about services versus products, there are many examples. As a matter of fact, when I do design thinking workshops, it's more about services or experiences than it is about creating a new product. Much more. Now, this is used for product without a doubt. But when you think about human-centered design, it's about human experience. And we actually did one with an organization around service desk. It was something around how might we redesign the service desk to create a positive experience for the people who are using it. And it really went away. It didn't even talk about the software or the process in place, but it went to the end users and talked about, you know, tell me about your experiences when you have a problem. Why was that a problem for you? And then there's this great question that you use at the end of empathy after you do all your questions. And it's called the magic wand question. If you had a magic wand and could change anything about service management or the service desk, what would you do? Now, in a sense, you're almost asking them to design a solution. But when you watch people, when you ask them a magic wand question, their mind opens up. It's like, wow, if I could do anything, that's where you gain some really rich insights and some really rich content. You can impact education because you develop user-friendly systems. This is about, you know, UX and CX. It's a positive experience for the people who use your systems and processes. And as I mentioned before, this is all about collaborative experiences. It's about designing new experiences. People work together. They just organically want to work together when you're working on design thinking. And I think you heard Steve talk a little bit about that, although they were paid a little bit, so you always want to work with people when you get paid. But even so, regardless of what that is, you will find people will want to work together. So to wrap this up, you know, love this cartoon. And this is what happens, and this goes back to the question, how do I introduce design thinking? You're running an uphill fight, fighting an uphill battle, excuse me. This shows it well. You know, these guys are pulling this wagon with the square wheels. This guy's got the round wheels. Hey, no thanks, we're too busy. Everybody is too busy to learn something new, even if it can help them. So it's our responsibility to try and get them involved in this and bring it to them in a way that they're going to understand the potential. It's not about learn design thinking, here's what it looks like, here's a memo, I'm dating myself, here's an email, but more about experientially telling them what's in it for them and getting them excited about learning something new. So we talked about the design thinking approach. And again, this is it. These are the 5 steps. You don't need to know more than this. Now, there are other people who add on a step, an interim step here or there. Sometimes, like Steve was mentioning, you could use personas. You can do it for groups of people. There's little variations on a theme, but this, by and large, is it. You might see it formulated in a 3-step effort as well, but it really comes down to these 5 steps. But when you're doing it, you know, the thing to think about is this. When you're doing empathy, think about it this way. Who am I designing this solution for? What is their perspective? How do they see things? And what's their real need? And from an IT perspective, I always tell people in IT, this could be something as simple as somebody saying, I need a new report. What do? We go do the report for them. Do we ever ask, what are you trying to accomplish? What do you need? How are you using this? Even if it's okay and they have a real reason for it, you learn more about what they do and you can relate to them. Define. What insights did I gather from the empathy work? Are there unmet needs to address? And what is the real problem to solve? That's the purpose of define. When you get to ideate, how can I surprise and delight my users? Get wild and crazy here. Did I push myself creatively and remove assumed boundaries? Did I remove personal bias and experience? There's that topic again. If you're ideating, is it about them and what I learned, or am I just doing what I would have done anyway? Prototype. How can I create something to demonstrate my idea? Did I build with the user in mind? Am I okay with failing fast? And lastly, when you tested it, did you put it in the user's hand and note their feedback? Did you consider multiple prototypes? You can have multiple ideas that you're testing and maybe do multiple prototypes for those ideas. And one thing with tests, when you do test things and people give you feedback, don't defend yourself. Accept it. Ask for that feedback. You want that constructive criticism. So in layman's terms, when you're addressing a challenge, and this incorporates design thinking, step one, which we didn't talk about here, first thing is research your topic so you know more about it. Second, gain the perspective of users. Third, uncover insights from them. Four, define the opportunity, generate creative solutions, create a tangible prototype, elicit user feedback, and then rinse and repeat. Keep doing those last two steps. This doesn't matter if you're doing this major challenge at your university or you have a very simple project that you're working on yourselves. This is a very simple way of doing things that can be very successful in whatever industry you're in. So, the 7 deadly sins when solving a design thinking challenge. Number 1, jumping to a solution too quickly. We all do it. It's human nature. It's going to happen. 2, thinking you know what you want without understanding their perspective. You have to understand what the user's perspective is. Don't assume you already know what they want. 3, taking the time to conduct empathy and then disregarding it and doing what you were doing anyway. 4, not challenging the status quo in your solutions. Always ask if you're challenging the status quo when you're doing design thinking. 5, remaining focused on one idea from the start, that you know what it is and you can go through this stuff, but I have the answer ready. You may not. 6, selling your idea to users rather than eliciting unedited feedback. This is not about getting approval for your idea. It's about getting criticism to make sure you have the right idea and the right solution. And lastly, being afraid to fail. If you are a person who's really afraid to fail, then don't go into this space, because this is more about failing often to succeed sooner. So, Anton Chekhov, knowledge is of no value unless you put it into practice. When you learn design thinking, you don't have to run a design thinking challenge around things. You can use pieces of it and use it in what you do every day, whether it's just empathy or all 5 steps. You can do this in your organization. Rethink existing processes and structures. Create an effective learning culture. Do it with your customers, student, faculty, administrators, and so on. Define innovative solutions that handle their unmet needs. Think about Airbnb and Uber. You wonder why you didn't think about them or why I didn't think about them. It's because we didn't see any unmet needs and we didn't put 2 and 2 together necessarily. Both companies use design thinking quite a bit, by the way. With your partners, what about third-party vendors? Look for collaborative opportunities with internal and external partners to solve this together. It doesn't have to just be you that does this. And lastly, in your own work. Do it in your own jobs. I have seen people use design thinking to redesign their staff meetings. So I want to leave you with this last video. It's about a minute and a half. It's from Steve Jobs. And this goes back to what we talked about, that don't assume you have to do things just because they're there, because somebody told you that you have to. And this is Steve Jobs when he was with Next Computer back in '95, long before he invented any I thing. So have a listen. It's very impactful.
So the thing I would say is, when you grow up, you tend to get told that the world is the way it is, and your life is just to live your life inside the world, try not to bash into the walls too much, try to have a nice family life, have fun, save a little money. But life, that's a very limited life. Life can be much broader once you discover one simple fact, and that is everything around you that you call life was made up by people that were no smarter than you. And you can change it. You can influence it. You can build your own things that other people can use. And the minute that you understand that you can poke life and actually something will, if you push in, something will pop out the other side, that you can change it, you can mold it. That's maybe the most important thing, is to shake off this erroneous notion that life is there and you're just going to live in it, versus embrace it, change it, improve it, make your mark upon it. I think that's very important. And however you learn that, once you learn it, you'll want to change life and make it better, because it's kind of messed up in a lot of ways. Once you learn that, you'll never be the same again.
Pretty powerful stuff. Everything around you that you call life was put here by people who are no smarter than you. And for some reason, we have this thought in our brains that, well, the standards are here, and therefore that's what we have to work with, and then we'll work outside of them. We use them as a base. The reality is, the people who developed those standards were us. It wasn't anybody that was really smart that sat down and dedicated their time. They evolved over time based on old principles. One of my biggest concerns, frustrations, and criticisms of IT is we're still basing everything that we do with what we used in our roots back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And we have transformed so much, it's time to grow out of this. Design thinking is a way to help reinvent certain parts of IT, the way to reinvent and get us closer, and remind ourselves that everything around us that we call life was put here by people no smarter than us. So I think we're going to open this up for Q&A right now. Look at that hands.
Yeah, we're actually at 5 minutes to the hour and a half. So if you don't mind, we could send these responses to these questions out as part of the recording package, I think that would be great. I need to wrap up. So thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Susan and Steve. This does conclude our presentation. Thanks for all of you sticking till the end of this. A lot of information. Thank you for sharing your ideas and time with us today. Their contact information can be found on the slide deck. A reminder that if you're attending the EDUCAUSE conference and want more on what you heard today, consider signing up for the Design Thinking Pre-Conference Workshop. I'll put a link in the chat here. There are also 2 opportunities to provide feedback. At the end of this session, you'll get a link to take an exit survey, which is about the event itself. As part of the recording and the recording package, I'm going to send out a post-event survey in an email, which is really about what future topics you want to hear about, what future design thinking topics you want to hear about. So please give your feedback so it can help us plan future events. A reminder, the recording and other resources available that were mentioned today will be available on the ITSM CG website within 5 business days. I'm always looking for fresh ideas. If you've got something you want to talk on, a topic, I can help you get that going. Just reach out to me. My email is all over the place. Again, thank you so much, Jeff, Steve, and Susan. Enjoy your day, and I hope to see you at EDUCAUSE. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.